Good afternoon. Today is January the 14th, 2023. I hope everybody's having a good day. I'm want to talk this afternoon about principally three events that occurred 50 years ago today. Two that got a lot of publicity throughout the country and even throughout the world, and another event that got a lot of local publicity, but that was about it. Uh, 50 years ago today, I've already talked about January 1973 book by James Rodinault. The subtitle is uh, Watergate, Roe v. Wade, Vietnam, and the Month That Changed America Forever. And it was in 1972 that I turned 21 on May 22nd. And I completed my junior year at Baylor and started that fall my senior year. I got called in June 18th, 1972, to my first pastorate at the Whitney Missionary Baptist Church in Whitney, Texas. And in November, Richard Nixon was reelected President of the United States. So by January 14th, a lot of things had changed. I was about to start the last semester of my senior year and receive my BA in May. But at the meantime, Nixon, of course, was looking forward to his second inauguration on Saturday, January the 20th. And the new year had few people had any premonition that so many things were going to happen so quickly to make changes in the country and the world. But that weekend, Saturday, January 13th, and Sunday, January 14th, 1973, in Key Biscayne, Florida, Henry Kissinger took off from Paris at the scheduled time. His ultimate destination was no longer Washington. He would stop there only briefly to pick up Al Haig and then would head for Florida. Nixon insisted the two join him in Key Biscayne, where he had flown on Friday afternoon, January the 12th. The morning before he left for Florida, Nixon fussed with H.L. Haldeman that they had to keep Kissinger in Florida for the entire week. He could hold his business meetings there and engage in his social stuff in Miami. As Haldeman noted in his diary, we have to keep the focus on Florida and with the P through the week. So he's got to stay there this time. Kissinger was not pleased about it. He cabled Colonel Kennedy that he had to be back in Washington for necessary meetings the first part of the week after reporting to the president in Florida. But recognizing that his desires may not matter much in the circumstances, Kissinger wrote dejectedly to Kennedy, "For Key Biscayne, I will need the proper clothes." And so he asked the colonel to arrange to have sent down to Key Biscayne some sports clothes, which are in the right hand closet, the one closest to the window, my bathing suit in the lower left hand drawer of my bureau. Also, there's a wide belt in the upper right hand drawer. One needed proper attire to end a war. Nixon stayed up late Saturday into the wee hours of Sunday, January 14th, to greet Kissinger and Haig when they arrived. He and Bebe Rebozo waited in the tropical breezes at the Key Biscayne compound helipad for two men. The helicopter carrying Kissinger and Haig from the nearby Homestead Air Force Base finally touched down at 1:15 a.m. Back at the president's residence, they talked until 2:30 in the morning, going over the negotiations. Kissinger had been up for more than 24 hours. In his diary, Nixon wrote that he walked Kissinger out to his car after the debriefing and told him the country was indebted to him for what he had done. This was almost intimate interaction was highly unusual for Nixon. By his own admission, he wrote that it was not really a comfortable feeling for me to praise people so openly, but he thought Kissinger expected it, and it was good that I did so. According to Nixon, Kissinger, in turn, warmly responded with, "Without my having, as he put it, the courage to make the difficult decision on December 18th, we would not be where we are today." Kissinger remembered the encounter in a similar vein. That strange man, he wrote, in White House years, who would be so ruthless, fierce, and devious in defending his turf, was capable of considerable great gentleness in his personal dealings. Kissinger saw this side of Nixon on this night. Though I was unhappy with some of Nixon's actions toward me, though I objected to some of his tactics, I felt that night an odd tenderness toward him. Kissinger thought that Nixon was entitled in an hour of triumph to the limelight. He wrote, "We spoke to each other in near affectionate terms, like veterans of bitter battles at a last reunion, even though we both sensed somehow that too much had happened between us to make the rest of the journey together." Later that night, Haig would fly out for Saigon with a letter from the president. So you see, it would be on January the 23rd, 9 days later, that Henry Kissinger and Lê Duc Tho would initial the uh, first draft of the peace treaty between between United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong, and they would be formally signed in a big ceremony on January the 27th. But back to January 14th, Nixon spent Sunday afternoon watching Super Bowl VII on television. It was played in Los Angeles with his friend Bebe Rebozo. The Miami Dolphins defeated Nixon's beloved Washington Redskins 14-7, a mark of distinction that still stands today. It was a defensive struggle with the safety Jake Scott winning the Most Valuable Player award in recognition of his two interceptions of Billy Kilmer passes, including a clincher in the fourth quarter. The game's most memorable moment came with less than 3 minutes to play in the fourth quarter. The Dolphins had dominated the game and led 14-0. A drive by the Dolphins stalled in the Redskins' territory, and rather than punt the ball, Coach Don Shula decided to go for a 42-yard field goal to make it 17-0, a symbolic score for a team that would end the season with 17 wins and no losses. That's the first time that ever happened, and it hasn't happened since. Understand the Dolphins won 14 season games, 2 playoffs, and finally, on January 14th, 1973, they won the Super Bowl. And things didn't, after they went terribly wrong. Kicker Gero Yepremian, the former soccer player from Cyprus, kicked a low ball. It was blocked right back to him. Panicked, Yepremian scooped up the ball and started to run. But with an angry Redskins lineman bearing down on him, he decided it was a good time to attempt a forward pass. The ball slipped out of his tiny grip. It was batted and floated straight up in the air. It landed in the hands of Mike Bass of the Redskins, who ran it back for a touchdown, making the score 14-7 with just 2 minutes and 7 seconds left to play. Interestingly enough, I have a nephew named Mike Bass, but he wasn't born until the 1980s, so this is not the same Mike Bass. Fortunately for Yepremian, the Dolphins' defense held and they won the game. Because of the widening Watergate scandal, the Dolphins did not make the traditional celebratory visit to the White House later that summer. It wasn't until August 2013, 40 years later, that they finally made the trip at the request of President Barack Obama. So, Super Bowl VII was January 14th, 1973, 50 years ago today. And there was also a big concert that day. After a 7-year hiatus from live performance to focus on his acting career, Elvis Presley had returned with his 1968 NBC television special Elvis. And following the critical success of the special, by 1969 he returned to record non-soundtrack albums with the release of Elvis in Memphis. But he made a number of other appearances. And then it was set up for him to perform in Honolulu on January the 14th. The rehearsal show took place on Friday, January the 12th. Fans stormed the arena as the doors opened at 7 p.m., 2 hours before the start of the show. And the audience was standing or sitting in the aisles. And the Honolulu mayor, Frank Fozzie, declared January 13th Elvis Presley Day to commend him for his contribution to the Ku Lee Cancer Fund. And so he got a lot of publicity over this. But Aloha from Hawaii concert took place on January the 14th at 12:30 a.m. local time to match the prime time of the broadcast locations of the concert: Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, South Vietnam, the Philippines, and Australia. Admission was more restricted for the Saturday show. Parker arranged entertainment for the fans turned away after the limit was reached, featuring high school bands, clowns, and robots. And the new technical issues arose as NBC's recording equipment, combined with RCA Records equipment brought by engineer Wally Helder, overloaded the power sources. The issue was fixed, but 2 hours before the start of the show, the sound system picked up a hum caused by stage lights. Sound engineers borrowed thick lead sheets from the United States Navy to isolate the equipment. Teenage fans were present in the first rows, while most of the audience was reported to be people in their 40s. Among the audience were Mayor Fosse, Jack Lord, and Ku Lee's family. But his set list consisted of 22 songs, and he made his usual entrance as the band played 2001 Space Odyssey, and the set featured classics from his repertoire: Blue Suede Shoes, Hound Dog, and Love Me. He performed the ballads You Gave Me a Mountain, My Way, I Can't Stop Loving You, What Now My Love, Ku Lee's I'll Remember You, and American Trilogy, among others. American Trilogy is a mixture of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, Dixieland, and All My Trials. He closed with Can't Help Falling in Love. At the start of the number, he was covered with short cape by his assistant, Charles Hodge. As he finished, he displayed the cape by opening it and raising it with his hands as he took a knee. He threw the cape into the first rows, then gave the audience the Shaka sign and received the golden crown from the fans as he walked away. And so that was quite a concert. It brought it brought in quite a bit of money, and initial reports estimated the show was seen by 1.5 million people in 36 countries, and the biggest concert yet for that day. And RCA Records released the soundtrack album worldwide in February 1973. So, music fans had a big concert to listen to. Sports fans had a big game. People all over the country and even in foreign countries knew about it. But the third thing happened that day, January 14th, 1973, in Whitney, Texas. Recently, a friend in Whitney agreed with me that didn't get as much publicity, but it was big news in the little hamlet of Whitney, Texas. This was on a Sunday. I was pastor of the Missionary Baptist Church. I've been there since June. Actually, I'd started preaching there in May and preached 5 Sundays in a row before they decided to call me as pastor. First sermon was on May 21st, and I was called June 18th. I was ordained as a Baptist minister on July 23rd. I was determined to reach the youth of the community, which in theory was okay, but the members of the church and some other people in the community didn't like the way I did it. I grew up in Waco, was raised Southern Baptist, and I understand missionary Baptists have a reputation of being even more conservative than Southern Baptist. I often state that I agreed with everything that I was taught as a Southern Baptist except for one thing. I didn't believe, and still don't believe, that dancing is a sin. There was some dances held at the Lake Whitney Country Club after football games, and I attended the games and the dances, seeking to get young people to come to my church. I remember one young lady asked, "Are you a preacher?" And I said, "Yes." "You like to dance?" I said, "Yes." "Well, you're a real cool preacher then." And in December, they opened up a teen rec center called The Attic, and dances were held on Friday and Saturday night. It became very controversial, to say the least. A lot of the kids were hanging out down there, and I went down there. Invited them to church and danced with them as well. One friend that I had met for the first time at one of the country club dances was Doug Miller, an African American. Doug Miller at the time was 15 and I was 21. Doug's still a good friend. He's 65 today and I'm 71. So that's how far back we go. I asked him when I first met him if he knew Reverend William Lott, who was then pastor of the Pleasant Hill Baptist Church. He said, "Yes, he's my pastor." Reverend Lott passed away a number of years ago, but he was a friend of mine, and I always thought a lot of him. He only stayed there a short time, just as I did, but he had a number of pastorates after that, as I have also had. and I got to preach for him once when he was serving a church at Clifton a number of years later. Reverend William, he was pastor at Pleasant Hill, the Black Baptist Church in Whitney. And on New Year's Eve, 1972, young man from our church, Gary Simon, brought the evening message. He had preached on racism, attacking it as incompatible with Christianity. Doug Miller came and visited our church, and some of the people, being very racist, objected to his presence there. Well, after church that night, it was a Sunday night, December 31st, there was 9 of us from Whitney. Doug was one of them, Gary Simon, Gary's brother Dennis, Mary Howarth, with whom I recently became friends on Facebook and with whom I've had some interesting conversations, her sister Debbie Howarth, friend Donna Larson, Judy Beth Wooten, my friend from Waco, David Lanier, and myself, 9 of us. We went to Waco after church. We danced and partied at Magic Music, then located at 8th and Washington. It was on earlier that afternoon that one of the members, this was December 31st, this lady called me at the church. The first sign I heard of this. What's this I hear about you going to a dance? And I said, yes, I do. I did. Well, you're going to lose your church. They've never allowed it. Well, you'll probably get it. You can get another one. Well, and eventually I started getting phone calls from different people wanting to know if it was true that I had gone dancing at the attic and later took a group of kids to Waco to Magic Music. And I didn't try to hide anything. I said, yes, I don't believe there's any, the Bible does not teach that dancing is a sin. That's a man-made doctrine. Nobody was able to prove to me scripturally that it was, but that was their tradition. And it would be over 10 years later. I believe, in fact, it was 11 years exactly that in 1984, the movie Footloose came out. If anybody has seen that, one of the most memorable scenes is when Ren McCormick stands before the city council. His girlfriend, Ariel, has looked up various passages of scripture related to dancing, and Ren uses those verses when he speaks before the city council. Well, he had no more success with that city council in this fictitious story than I had with the Missionary Baptist Church in this real life story. There was also members of the First Baptist Church of Whitney and the Church of Christ who were very critical of some of my activities. I was asked to resign, but I wouldn't do so. This was really my first political battle. I visited that last week with a lot of different people, tried to drum up support, and as it turned out, it was a very close election. And I still believe to this day that if things had been done fairly, I would have won. But they went to the trouble of taking somebody's name off the roll so that their vote wouldn't count. And then B.T. Carroll, the church's oldest deacon, when we were having the conference, we had the church conference right after the evening service. That day, January 14th, we had the morning service. And I preached about the Pharisees, whose legalistic approach to life was condemned by Jesus. Said the Pharisees made life difficult for themselves and bitter for others. Aren't there people like that today? A group of my friends from Waco had come up to be in my corner that morning, and one of them said um, later, "You did everything but call names." That evening, my sermon was on the cost of caring. It was less controversial, but I made attacks on legalism and lack of concern for others and injustice. So, what happened though? The church was very upset about me going dancing. They were also upset about Doug coming. They didn't want to integrate the church. Well, the conference was held afterward, and there were a lot of kids from Whitney, junior high and high school, all ages, that came and almost filled the church up that night. And when I went into conference, I told the V.T. Carroll said, since the new business concerns you, I move Odell Tibble serve as moderator. And the first thing Tibble said when he got up was, only those who are members of the church will be allowed to vote. If everybody there had come earlier, a few months earlier, like I'd hoped they would, and joined the church, then the result would have been very different. In fact, Doug and I were talking the other day, and he said, "Yeah, if the kids could have voted, you'd still be there." But anyway, obviously, I had more people in my corner than opposed to me, but the ones that were in my corner didn't have the right to vote because they were not members of the church. One, because the name is Dirty Politics was used, and the person's name was kept off the roll. As moderator, Tidwell came to him to cast a deciding vote, and he voted against me. In the weeks that followed, I did everything I could to try to figure out a way to have the election overturned and get back in there somehow. And I was looking through alternative methods of starting another church and finding some way to salvage my ministry in Whitney, but nothing worked. And it was a couple of months later, I don't remember the exact date, that I was on the Baylor campus, and a fellow named Pat McLaughlin, a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin, was on campus to recruit students to sell for Southwestern Company out of Nashville, a publishing house. And he knocked on my windshield and he said, "You need a summer job?" I said, "I sure do." He said, "We're having a meeting over here in Old Main." Gave me the room number. I said, "Give me a few minutes. I need to go to the bookstore and get some books. And as soon as I get back, I'll join you over there." And that's what I did. And I signed up to sell books that summer. What does that have to do with Whitney? Well, when I got this job offer for the summer, you might say that was a graceful way to bow out. And I abandoned all efforts to try to establish some kind of ministry in Whitney. I did graduate on May 18th. But in the meantime, the Hillsborough Daily Mirror, a paper that's no longer published, I was told to take the story of the firing to them because that editor had a reputation of publishing anything. And so it was published. And some people's names were in it. They didn't like having their names in it. But anyway, the Whitney Messenger, my name only appeared in there once after that, when it was a few months later that they did publish the news that I was fixing to receive my BA from Baylor. I graduated May 18th, spent the summer working in Virginia, did very well, a beautiful Appalachian community of Pulaski, Virginia. Came back to Waco that September. Started graduate school at Baylor to work on my MA in Church State Studies. And I joined St. Mary's Baptist Church, an African American congregation. Was there for a year and a half until I made a denominational switch to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a church I'm still with today, and having served several congregations. 1973 was a very busy year for me, a very good year as a whole. Even though losing a job is never an enjoyable experience, and certainly not losing a pastorate, but I've never regretted standing up for the issues that I believed in and still believe in. Racial discrimination is wrong, and there's nothing wrong with dancing. As far as people's response to me from the church and community and other people, as I've told the story over the years, and I know 50 years ago was a long time. It's not discussed as much as it was right after it happened, but it's interesting the different range of responses that I've gotten. On the one hand, I found people who believe that dancing is a sin and or believe that racial segregation is justified, perhaps through their misinterpretation of Genesis 9, the curse of Ham, or for some other reason. But racism plus opposition to dancing, you find people who took my congregation's side 100%. I've had other people who would not argue that dancing was a sin in and of itself, but they would quote the Apostle Paul about putting a stumbling block in your brother's path and comparing it to eating meat offered to idols. I don't believe that analogy is legitimate at all. Paul, for example, rebuked the Judaizers who were claiming that one had to become a Jew before they could become a Christian. And he said that was wrong. And I believe there's more of an analogy there saying the teaching opposition to dancing is just as bad as them saying you got to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. Nobody would say that today, but they still try to invoke this in regarding to dancing. There were some who didn't use scripture or anything else, but who put it like this: they have a right to decide what kind of pastor they want. That hurts. And try to minimize the importance of taking a stand for what one believes. There were some who generally agreed with me on the issues, but they didn't understand why I wanted to fight it. They didn't want, they don't want you to get out of there. Well, some of them did want me, and there's some who don't care at all, one way or the other. No big deal. Then there's those who are 100% in my corner. So it runs the gamut. And for 50 years, I've heard different responses to this. I love the town of Whitney, nevertheless. Very important historic community. In the last 50 years, I don't think there's even been 1 year that I have not gone to Whitney at least one time for something. Some years I've gone to Whitney more than others. I was last in Whitney last year on May the 21st for the funeral or burial of N.O. Williams, a very good friend of mine, a member of Whitney, of the Pleasant Hill Baptist Church of Whitney. Beginning in 1987, I first went to the homecoming service there when I was pastor in Whitney in 1972. I believe it was on October the 8th. And that was at Pleasant Hill. Then I was 1987, after I completed my ministry at Macedonia AME Church Kaufman. I started attending annual homecoming services in the month of October at Pleasant Hill. I preached there many, many times over the years, have been a strong supporter financially of the church. And I have, in 1998, I got a historical marker for Pleasant Hill Baptist Church. I found it interesting that was my second marker. The first one I got in 1985 for the Terrell State Hospital Cemetery. And I found out that the property at Pleasant Hill was bought in 1901 from Dr. D.R. Wallace of Waco, who was the first superintendent of Terrell State Hospital. I got pictures of Dr. Wallace and of his statue above his grave at Oakwood Cemetery in Waco at Pleasant Hill Baptist Church in Whitney. And I've gotten that church. I love Pleasant Hill. I love Whitney. I don't know any of the current members. Oh, by the way, it was in the early 2000s. I wrote articles for Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the history of Hill County. I wrote a history of the Whitney Missionary Baptist Church. I wrote a biographical article on John Nathaniel Wolfe, the first pastor of the Missionary Baptist Church, and Fenton E. Weller, who was pastor there from 1927 to 1958. Very legendary pastor. And I also published an article in the volumes on the history of Pleasant Hill Baptist Church and the now defunct Payne Chapel AME Church of Whitney, as well as another church where I preached, and that's Wade Chapel AME Church in Hillsboro, which is still operating. January 14th has been a very important day to me. Some people thought that I would leave the ministry as a result of what happened 50 years ago. God called me. They didn't. And Mary Howarth sent a text the other day as we were reminiscing. She was saying that everybody seemed to have so much fun on New Year's Eve at Magic Music. She says, thank you for taking us all. And even though it cost you your job. But as God, with the way it works with God, anytime one door closes, another one opens. And that's the way it's been throughout my life. I would like to be reconciled with the Missionary Baptist Church. I don't know any of the current members. The ones that were involved in my getting rid of me are long deceased. I don't know if they're as strict as they were, if they held the same beliefs as they did back then. Sometimes people are willing to say, okay, you were right, I was wrong. But a lot of times you can't get to that point. Sometimes you just got to agree to disagree. Nobody should be forced against their will to dance or not to dance. Can we agree on that point? Well, maybe in society, but when it comes within the church itself, they got certain standards they need to follow. Every church has their standards, and I certainly have mine. I believe those who preach the gospel need to live of the gospel, and I've sought to do that. But I see nothing in the Bible that says that dancing is a sin. Now, there's been all kinds of arguments. There was a sheet that was circulating at the high school at the time by Reverend Malcolm Harrington. X number, I forget the number of reasons that he said he didn't dance anymore. not any of them made the least bit of sense. I got those in a file somewhere. There was this guy Harrington. I don't know much about him, and believe I've searched the internet. But I haven't found anything about him or what publication that came from. And but it didn't make any sense. It was, but that was some people would do that. But there have been a number of communities. Whitney never had a anti-dancing ordinance, to my knowledge. There have been uh, some cities that have. Most of them have gotten rid of them. One was Elmore City, Oklahoma, which uh, served actually as a model. Their effort to get rid of the anti-dancing ordinance that was successful served as a model for the movie Footloose. There was Rush Springs and um, Henrietta, I believe, were two towns in Oklahoma that had similar battles. There was also Pound, Virginia, and Anson, Texas. There's a book about events about getting rid of the anti-dancing ordinance. To be honest, I have not read that book. I've looked at the review of it on Amazon before, and uh, there was also some of the same people who were confronting the anti-dancing ordinance were also confronting racism. It seems to they go hand in hand often, and that's so ironic about Anson because uh, they would once a year at one time when they banned dancing most of the time they during the month of December they would make an exception and host the famous Cowboy Christmas Ball that was popularized the song by Michael Martin Murphey. And you can Google it. There have been so many deals where dancing's been an issue, but anyway, we need to be able to come together. Even if we can't see eye to eye, if we're Christians, we should at least be able to be friends and agree to disagree and say that you're not qualified to preach the pulpit because you don't agree with me on every single point of doctrine. Um, I know the whole issue of Christian unity, I could devote a video to that. It's a fact that the very night that Jesus prayed, that famous prayer that my disciples would be one even as I am one with God the Father, that very night the disciples were bickering over who was going to sit on the right hand and who was going to sit on the left. So there'll always be differences of opinion. But January 14th, 1973 was an important day in the history of the United States and the world and the history of my life. I love Whitney. I love the life that God has given me. I've been blessed in every church that I've served. There's been problems, there's been challenges, but God nevertheless is able. And I wish everybody a happy and blessed January 14th. And pray the year 2023 will bring blessings to all. Have a good evening.